Undocumented and alone, he bought the worst house, then realized it was built for him. Lucas spent the night on the living room floor, not sleeping so much as drifting in and out of awareness, his mind refusing to shut itself down completely. The dead phone rested on the table above him like a small, obsolete idol, stripped of power but not of meaning. He watched shadows stretch and recede as cars passed outside, each beam of light briefly animating the room. The house no longer tried to hide its expectations, and that honesty felt almost respectful. IT assumed he would stay, because staying had once been the safest option available to him. Lucas acknowledged that truth without letting it harden into obligation. Safety built on erasure was not safety at all, just a slower kind of harm by morning. He knew he could not leave without confronting the source. At dawn, he took a notebook from the basement and began to write again. Not to document compliance or routines, but to anchor himself in sequence and intention. He wrote his name at the top of the page, repeating it until it felt solid. The act stirred a quiet defiance. Small but persistent, he outlined what he knew, what he suspected, and what remained deliberately obscured. Patterns emerged quickly once he allowed himself to see them. The house was not isolated. It was positioned close enough to be monitored without drawing attention. Whoever had designed this place had needed proximity, not distance. Lucas left the house for the first time that morning, not to escape but to observe. He walked the block slowly, noting sightlines, angles, places where someone could watch without being seen. Most of the houses showed signs of long occupancy, routines worn into their structures. Point one stood out for its stillness, its windows always curtained, its yard meticulously maintained. IT did not advertise neglect or warmth, only control. Lucas passed it twice, then a third time, confirming the pattern of visibility. From its front window, the back door of his house would be perfectly framed. The realization settled with grim certainty. He did not confront the house immediately, because confrontation without preparation had once cost him years. Instead, he returned home and began dismantling small things. He removed panels, shifted furniture, disrupted the silent choreography the house had enforced. Each change felt like reclaiming a fraction of space that had never truly been his. The house responded not with resistance but with emptiness, as if confused by deviation. Lucas found that satisfying, a quiet, controlled way he was. No longer performing the role expected of him, he was rewriting the conditions. In the afternoon, a knock sounded at the front door. IT was light, polite, the kind meant not to alarm. Lucas did not answer immediately, choosing instead to observe from the hallway. Through the narrow gap in blinds, he saw a man standing with practiced stillness, middle-aged, well-dressed, carry himself with the calm authority of someone used to being trusted. Lucas felt recognition surge, sharp and unmistakable. This was a face from the edges of memory, softened by time but intact. The past had not found him by accident. When Lucas opened the door, the man smiled with genuine relief. He spoke Lucas's name carefully, as if testing whether it would still be accepted. He apologized for not announcing himself sooner, citing concern and discretion. The language was familiar, curated to sound like care. Lucas listened without interrupting, noting how easily the old rhythms returned. The man spoke of observation, of patterns, of ensuring Lucas was not overwhelmed by the world. He framed the house as a solution, a sanctuary, designed to protect Lucas from harm. At no point did he ask what Lucas wanted. Lucas felt something steady settle into place as the man finished speaking. The years of confusion, compliance, and quiet endurance aligned around this figure. This was the architect, the constant presence behind every controlled choice. That he thanked the man calmly, surprising them both. Then he asked a single question, delivered without accusation or heat. He asked how many others had been given houses like this. The man hesitated, just long enough to answer without words. That hesitation changed everything. Lucas stayed seated long after the light outside began to thin, watching the kitchen sink reflect a version of himself he barely recognized. The idea that it had been here before did not arrive with panic, but with a slow, suffocating familiarity. IT felt like remembering a dream you once mistook for reality, and then buried because it explained too much. He tried to reconstruct his past with deliberate care, tracing each year like a map drawn from fading ink. There had been shelters, temporary, addresses, rooms rented under names he no longer used. He had learned to erase himself methodically, leaving no residue strong enough to follow. Yet memory has a way of storing what identity discards, waiting for the right pressure surface. The house seemed built to apply that pressure evenly and without mercy. He walked through the rooms again, slower this time, allowing impressions to settle instead of fighting them. The living room carried the weight of waiting. Furniture arranged as if someone had once expected company that never arrived. Lucas noticed dents in the floor where heavy objects had been dragged repeatedly. Each mark suggested routine rather than chaos, a system shaped by endurance. He imagined himself performing small acts to stay grounded, repeating motions to avoid unraveling. That image felt less like speculation and more like recollection. The house did not feel hostile in those moments, only insistent. IT wanted him present, attentive, unprotected by denial. Upstairs, the narrow room called him again with quiet persistence. He stood in the doorway, no longer afraid of what it contained, but of what it reflected. The scratches on the walls began to arrange themselves into meaning the longer he stared. They were tallies, not days, but repetitions, moments endured rather than survived. Lucas remembered counting breaths once, marking time because clocks were forbidden. The absence of a window now felt deliberate, engineered to remove context and resistance. He stepped fully inside, closing the door behind him without flinching. The room accepted him without protest. Standing there, he felt the echo of restraint in his shoulders and wrists. His body responded before his mind could intervene, posture adjusting to remembered limits. He pressed his back against the wall, noting how naturally he fit into the space. There was no doubt left to deny or soften what was unfolding. This room was not a coincidence left behind by strangers. IT was a replica, faithful down to its dimensions and silence. Lucas closed his eyes and allowed the memory to complete itself. That he had not escaped once. He had escaped twice. The realization shifted something fundamental inside him. Fear gave way to anger, not explosive but cold and clarifying. Someone had found him after the first escape and chosen containment over capture. The house was not meant to hide him from the world, but from himself. IT had been designed as a return, a continuation disguised as refuge. Lucas felt the old discipline stir, the survival instincts he had buried under anonymity. He was no longer just reacting. He was assessing. An assessment brought with it the possibility of refusal. Back downstairs, he examined the notes again with sharper focus. They were not warnings or instructions, but reminders written in a language associated with compliance. Each circled line translated loosely to the same idea, though phrased differently each time. The meaning coalesced slowly, heavy with intention and repetition. IT spoke of forgetting as a kindness and silence as cooperation. Lucas remembered being taught that remembering was a form of resistance. The notes were not hidden from him. They were left for him. They were meant to guide him back into erasure. Night fell fully, and with it came the familiar tension of being unseen but monitored. Lucas moved to the house without turning on lights. Trusting muscle memory, he did not remember earning. He tested doors, windows, corners, discovering small modifications meant to discourage exit without announcing themselves. Nothing was locked outright, but everything resisted subtly. IT was the same strategy that had been used before, reducing escape to exhaustion. Lucas felt a grim respect for the design, for its patience and cruelty. This was not the work of chance or neglect. That IT was the work of someone who believed they were helping. As he returned to the kitchen, a final detail settled into place with quiet finality. The deed to the house had been waiting on the count of the day he moved an real estate agent. No delays, no negotiations. He had assumed indifference or oversight had worked in his favor. Now he understood it as confirmation rather than transaction. The house had not been sold. IT had been returned. And the question was whether he would stay long enough to disappear again. The man's hesitation lingered in the air between them, heavier than any confession could have been. Lucas watched the subtle shift in posture, the way confidence recalibrated into calculation. This was not a conversation the man had rehearsed often, which told Lucas everything he needed to know. He invited the man inside with a gesture that was polite enough to be disarming. The house seemed to recognize the newcomer, its silence adjusting around him like accommodation. Lucas closed the door behind them and felt the balance of the room change. For the first time since arriving, he was not the only one being measured. That inversion brought a quiet, unexpected calm. They sat across from each other in the living room, the distance carefully maintained. The man introduced himself by first name only. As if familiarity could be rebuilt on demand, he spoke about programs and oversight, about vulnerable individuals and structured environments. Every phrase was wrapped in professional concern, stripped of overt cruelty. Lucas listened with the same attention he once used to survive interrogations. The man described houses like this one as necessary interventions, places where people could be kept safe from themselves. He avoided the word confinement, favoring language like stabilization and care. Lucas noted each omission as carefully as each claim. When Lucas asked again how many houses existed, the man sighed and answered with a number that felt both precise and evasive. There were others scattered, each tailored to a specific profile. None of them were officially recorded as anything other than private residences. Lucas imagined lives folding inward behind similar walls, people mistaking endurance for healing. The man insisted participation had always been voluntary, that consent had been obtained when necessary. Lucas did not argue, because arguing would have granted legitimacy to the premise. Instead, he asked how consent was measured when memory itself was manipulated. The man did not answer that. The conversation shifted as the man began to sense a change in control. He reminded Lucas of the risks outside, the instability, the scrutiny waiting beyond anonymity. He spoke of how easily old patterns could return without structure. Lucas recognized the tactic, the careful invocation of fear framed as foresight. He felt the urge to retreat flicker briefly, a conditioned response. But the notebooks in the basement had taught him something important. Endurance without agency had nearly erased him. Once he would not mistake that for care again. Lucas stood and walked a window, looking out at the street he had once wanted to disappear into. He told a man that protection without choice was indistinguishable from captivity. The house, he said, had preserved a version of him that survived by shrinking. He acknowledged that version with respect, but he did not intend to live as it anymore. The man listened, his expression tightening as control slipped further away. Lucas could see the calculation behind the eyes, the assessment of damage, control. This was not about him alone. Lucas realized IT never had been. He returned to his seat and asked one final question. Quieter than the others, he asked what would happen if someone chose to remember publicly. The man's composure fractured just enough to reveal the truth beneath. Reputation, legality, and fragility of carefully maintained narratives surfaced in his response. The program depended on silence, on gratitude, on people believing disappearance was mercy. Lucas felt the weight of that responsibility settle into place. He had spent years erasing himself to survive. Now survival required the opposite. The man stood, signaling the end of the visit with practiced grace. He warned Lucas, gently, about consequences framed as concern. Lucas nodded, understanding that being seen again would invite resistance, but it would also invite accountability, something the house had never required. As the man left, the house seemed to exhale, its purpose destabilized. Lucas closed the door and leaned against it. feeling the finality of the moment. The house no longer waited expectantly. IT waited to be redefined. Lucas went to the basement one last time and gathered the notebooks. He did not destroy them, because erasure was no longer an option he trusted. Instead, he packed them carefully, along with the notes and the dead phone. These were not relics of weakness, but evidence of survival under constraint. He understood now that stories like it survived only in isolation because isolation had been enforced. Bringing them into the open would be painful and slow, but pain was no longer something he feared more than silence. The house had given him that clarity, whether intended to or not. Lucas spent the rest of the night awake, seated at the kitchen table with his back to the wall. Letting the house exist around him without interference, he did not pace or search or rehearse escape routes, because urgency had once been used against him as effectively as chains. Instead, he observed the way the floor cooled near dawn and how the pipes sighed just before the light began to shift. The house behaved less like a structure and more like a routine, repeating patterns it expected him to. Followed, he realized then that whoever had designed this place had relied on familiarity as their strongest restraint. They assumed memory would do the work they no longer needed to supervise. Lucas understood that assumption intimately, because it had almost worked. Almost. When morning arrived, it brought no clarity, only contrast. Sunlight revealed ordinary flaws that made the house resemble every other failed renovation on the street. From outside, it could be mistaken for a poor decision rather than a deliberate one. That Lucas watched a neighbor load groceries into a car. Noticed how unremarkable the scene felt. This was a version of the world he had fought to re-enter, unnoticed and unconcerned. The house stood between him, and that simplicity like a quiet accusation. He wondered how many times he had stood at windows like this before, measuring distance instead of freedom. The thought left him with a familiar ache behind the eyes. He decided to search the basement next, not because he expected answers, but because avoidance had once been mistaken for safety. The door was tucked behind the stairs, its handle worn smooth by frequent use. As he descended, the air grew colder, carrying the smell of earth and old moisture. The basement light flickered before stabilizing, illuminating a space too organized for neglect. Shelves lined the walls, holding jars, tools, and notebooks arranged with deliberate care. Lucas felt a tightening in his chest as he stepped fully inside. This was not storage, it was maintenance, and he had been the subject. On a workbench near the back wall, he found a stack of notebooks bound in plain covers. Each one was labeled only with dates, the handwriting consistent and restrained. Lucas opened the first, bracing himself with a familiar disorientation of seeing his own life described by someone else. Instead, the entries were written in first person. They detailed routines, setbacks, moments of resistance, and long periods of compliance. The language was stripped of emotion, focused on observation and adjustment. IT read like a manual written by someone trying to survive themselves. Lucas closed the notebook slowly, his hand steady despite the weight of recognition. He opened another, then another, each one filling gaps he had not known existed. The writing charted progress measured not an escape attempts, but an emotional dulling. He read about days spent relearning how to speak less, think less, want less. The entry spoke of forgetting as an achievement and numbness as relief. Lucas recognized a voice not as an enemy, but as a version of himself shaped by necessity. That realization cut deeper than accusation ever could. This house had not been built to punish him. That IT had been built to preserve a version of him that could endure captivity. The final notebook was thinner, its pages more erratic. The handwriting wavered, words crowded together as if afraid of silence. Lucas felt his pulse quicken as he read about a plan forming slowly, quietly. There were references to observation lapses, routines exploited, trust simulated. The tone shifted from endurance to intent, from survival to escape. The last entry ended abruptly mid-sentence. The ink smudged by haste. Lucas closed the notebook and exhaled, realizing he was holding his breath. This was the moment he had remembered as freedom. The basement felt heavier after that, as though the air itself resisted movement. Lucas replaced the notebooks carefully, respecting the order they had been kept in. He understood now that returning here had never been an accident or failure. Someone had believed he would eventually need the structure again. They had underestimated the cost of remembering. Lucas climbed the stairs with measured calm, carrying the knowledge like a concealed blade. The house no longer felt like a trap, but a proposition. Stay and disappear, or leave and confront what waited beyond anonymity. As he reached the kitchen, he noticed the back door standing open for the first time. The chair had placed her lay on its side, undisturbed but displaced. Cool air moved through the room, carrying the ordinary sound of the street. The house was offering him the same choice it always had, framed as convenience rather than command. Lucas stood in the doorway, feeling the weight of past obedience pressing against present resolve. He knew now that invisibility had never been the reward. IT had been the condition, and stepping outside would mean choosing to be seen again. Lucas left the house just before sunrise, carrying the notebooks in a plain box that looked unremarkable to anyone who might notice. The street was quiet in a way only early mornings can be, suspended between rest and routine. He did not look back at the house, not out of fear, but because he understood its role clearly now. IT had been built to hold a story in place, to keep it contained and manageable, be while leaving with its contents intact. He was not abandoning it, but emptying it of purpose. The house would still stand, but it would no longer function as intended. Structures designed for silence do not survive exposure. They depend on forgetting to remain intact. The central mystery resolved itself not as a single revelation, but as a pattern finally seen whole. Lucas had not been hunted randomly, nor sheltered generously. He had been categorized, managed, and returned to a system that mistook control for care. The unlocked door had never been an oversight. IT had been a test of whether he would choose obedience over uncertainty. The footsteps had not been another presence, but the echo of a self trained to move quietly. And the notes had not been warnings, but reinforcements for forgetting. The house had been waiting because it had been confident. In the days that followed, Lucas began telling his story carefully, selectively, but truthfully he did not dramatize it, because drama would have made it easier to dismiss. Instead, he focused on process, on language, on how kindness can be weaponized through structure. He found others, slowly at first, who recognized pieces of themselves in his account. Different houses, different cities, but the same logic and the same vocabulary. Some had never left, only adjusted. Others had left without. Understanding why return to normal life felt impossible. The pattern, once named, could no longer hide. The man who had overseen the house disappeared from public view quietly, the way such figures often do. There were no dramatic arrests or public reckonings at first. Instead, there were audits, resignations, sealed inquiries that began to crack under pressure. Lucas did not mistake this for victory. He knew systems rarely collapse all at once, but he also knew that silence had been their strongest defense. Each story shared weakened that defense incrementally. That was enough to begin. Months later, Lucas returned to the street once, not to reclaim the house, but to release it. A new family had moved in. Unaware of what the walls had once held, he did not warn them, because fear was not the inheritance he wanted to pass on. Some places do not remain prisons once their stories are removed. They become ordinary again, stripped of the meaning imposed on them. Lucas felt no pull to go inside. The house no longer recognized him as its subject. That separation felt complete. What remained with him was not the house, but the understanding forged within it. He had believed invisibility would keep him safe, because being seen had once been dangerous. But safety built on erasure had nearly cost him his life without ever touching his body, be why choosing to tell what happened. He accepted exposure in exchange for agency. The past did not vanish because he named IT. IT lost its power to repeat unchecked. Some stories survive only because someone chooses to carry them forward. Lucas chose to be that someone. If this story stayed with you, subscribe to the channel for more narratives that explore memory, silence, and survival. New stories arrive regularly, and each one is told because someone chose not to disappear. Lucas placed his foot on the first step, feeling the wood flex beneath his weight as if it were testing him in return. The staircase carried the scent of old varnish and something human that had soaked too deeply into the grain to be cleaned away. He reminded himself that fear had a habit of inventing intention where there was only neglect. Still, each step upward felt like crossing a line he had promised himself never to approach again. The house seemed to narrow as he climbed, the walls drawing closer without actually moving to the top. The hallway waited in the same dull silence, unchanged yet no longer neutral. Lucas stood there longer than necessary, listening for breathing that might give everything a shape. Nothing answered, and that absence felt rehearsed. He moved toward the first bedroom again, opening the door wider this time. Daylight spilled across the floor, revealing footprints in the dust that had not been there before. They were faint but unmistakably recent, the heel marks deeper than the toes. Lucas followed them to the window, noticing how they stopped just short of the sill. Outside, the yard was empty, bordered by a fence that leaned as if tired of standing. There was no sign of disturbance, no broken branches or trampled grass. Whoever had stood here had not left through the window. The realization settled slowly, tightening his chest. In the second room, the boxes had shifted, their positions altered just enough to be undeniable. Lucas crouched, opening one with care, half expecting it to resist him. Inside were old clothes folded neatly, styles dated but well cared for. He brushed his fingers across a jacket sleeve and felt a shiver of familiarity. The size looked right, too right, as though it had once been worn by someone built like him. He closed the box quickly, unsettled by how easily his mind tried to fill in details. This house had been empty when he bought it, officially and legally empty, yet nothing here felt abandoned. The door to the narrow room drew him back despite his efforts to avoid it. He opened it again, forcing himself to step inside this time. The air was stale, unmoving, carrying the faint echo of breath held too long. The scratches on the walls caught the light differently now, revealing patterns he had missed. They were not random lines, but repeated shapes, over and over, at measured intervals. Lucas traced one slowly, his hand trembling as recognition edged closer. He had seen this before, years ago, in a place he never spoke about. The memory retreated just as quickly, leaving him cold and hollow. A sound behind him made Lucas turn sharply, his pulse spiking. The hallway was empty, but the door to the second bedroom stood open. He was certain he had closed it. The house felt suddenly active, no longer content to remain a passive container. Lucas backed out of the narrow room, closing the door with deliberate calm. He did not want to give the impression of panic, even to an empty space. Control had once been the difference between survival and disappearance. He clung to that thought as he moved. Downstairs, back in the kitchen, Lucas spread the note flat on the table. He copied the circled line onto a scrap of paper, writing it slowly, carefully. The letters triggered fragments of sound, syllables spoken in a harsh whisper. He remembered a room with no windows. Much like the one upstairs, a voice had repeated those words until they lost meaning and became instruction. Lucas pressed his palm against the table, grounding himself in the present. That life was supposed to be over, sealed away, and untraceable, yet the house seemed to disagree. He searched the cabinets next, not for food, but for reassurance. Tucked behind a loose panel, he found another folded note, identical in age. This one bore different writing, but the same circled emphasis. His throat tightened as he realized this was not an isolated message. Someone had placed these deliberately, carefully, as if mapping something. Lucas gathered the notes together, laying them side by side. The words varied, but the structure repeated with unsettling consistency. It felt like a conversation he had joined halfway through. Outside, a car passed, its sound briefly anchoring him to the world beyond the walls. Lucas watched through the window as it disappeared down the street. N01 slowed. No one looked toward the house with interest or concern. Invisibility had been a goal, and in that sense he had succeeded. But the isolation now felt less like safety and more like containment. The house did not need witnesses to function. It only needed him to stay. The thought settled into place with quiet certainty. As evening approached, Lucas realized something that made his stomach drop. The footsteps he had heard the night before matched his own weight and rhythm exactly. Every sound he remembered could have been his, displaced in time rather than space. The scratches upstairs aligned with his reach, his height, his desperate need to mark days. He sank into a chair, the pieces forming a shape he did not want to see that the house was waiting. It might not be waiting for a stranger. It might be waiting for him. To remember who he had been here before. The question was no longer who else was in the house, but when he had arrived the first time. Lucas did not step outside immediately. Because he understood how easily momentum could be mistaken for choice, he stood with one foot inside the kitchen and one foot near the threshold, letting the cold air settle against his skin. The street sounds were ordinary enough to feel unreal after the careful silence of the house. The dog barked somewhere down the block, a car door slammed, and life continued without noticing him. That indifference had once felt like mercy, but now it carried a quieter cruelty. If he left, no one would stop him, and no one would follow. The house would simply wait for someone else, or for him again. Lucas pulled the door shut and turned back inside. The decision did not feel like surrender, but it did feel heavy. He needed to understand who had built this place, and why they believed disappearance was kindness. The notebooks had been written by him, but the structure around them had not. Someone had invested time, resources, and belief into ensuring his compliance. That kind of effort was never anonymous. Lucas moved through the house with renewed attention, not as a captive, but as an investigator. He began noticing details he had overlooked before, choices embedded in design. Nothing here was arbitrary, and that meant nothing here was untraceable. In the upstairs hallway, he measured distances, counted steps, tested acoustics. The way sound traveled revealed hidden reinforcements behind the walls. Certain floorboards absorbed weight, while others amplified it, guiding movement unconsciously. Lucas realized the house had been teaching him how to move without being heard. That lesson had been taught before. Patiently and repeatedly, he felt anger surface again, sharper this time, directed not inward but outward. Someone had believed they knew what was best for him. That belief had shaped years of his life. He returned to the narrow room and sat on the floor, his back against the scratch wall. The space no longer threatened him, but still demanded honesty. He remembered fragments now. Faces without names, voices that spoke softly but never kindly. There had been discussions framed as concern, isolation presented as protection. They had told him the world was too dangerous, too loud, too unforgiving for someone like him. First, he had resisted, and then he had adapted. Adaptation had been praised, encouraged, rewarded with small freedoms. Freedom, he understood now, had been carefully rationed. Lucas stood and examined the scratches again, not as marks of despair but as evidence. Each line represented awareness, a refusal to let time dissolve entirely. Whoever had overseen this place had allowed the marks to remain. They were not mistakes, but pressure valves. The house needed him damaged enough to comply, but intact enough to function. That balance required monitoring, adjustment, and presence, which meant the person responsible had likely been nearby. Once, the thought narrowed Lucas's, focused to a single, unsettling possibility. Downstairs, he searched the living room walls more thoroughly, pressing along seams and corners. Behind a framed print, he found a shallow recess containing an old phone, its battery long dead. The motto was outdated, untraceable by modern standards. Lucas felt a chill as he imagined it ringing, not to summon help but to remind him of boundaries. He checked the call history stored in memory and found only one number repeated endlessly. The name attached to it had been erased, but the pattern was unmistakable. This phone had not been for emergencies, that IT had been for permission. As dusk approached again, Lucas felt the weight of exhaustion settle into his bones. Remembering was not dramatic or cathartic. It was draining and relentless. He understood now why forgetting had once felt like relief. But relief was not the same as safety, and silence was not the same as peace. The house had offered him a way to endure by shrinking himself. What it had not offered was a way to live. Lucas sat in the darkened living room, holding the dead phone in his hand. Somewhere beyond these walls, someone had believed he would always come back. Lucas thought buying the worst house on the block would finally make him invisible. No papers, no family, just walls no one wanted. The place was falling apart, but it was cheap and no one asked questions. Perfect for someone like him. The first night, he noticed the back door didn't lock. Not broken, just never locked. Then he heard footsteps above him. Slow, careful, like someone trying not to be heard. In the kitchen, taped under the sink, was a folded note. Old, yellow, written in a language Lucas barely understood. One line was circled again and again. Why would someone hide this here? And why did the house feel like it was waiting for him to find it? Lucas stood frozen in the kitchen long after the question finished forming in his mind, his fingers still holding the brittle note, as if it might dissolve if he loosened his grip. The house answered him with silence, so complete it felt deliberate, as though the walls were listening and choosing not to speak yet. He told himself the footsteps had been pipes or settling wood, or the imagination of a man who had slept too little for too many years. That explanation had always been enough before, back when he still believed places were neutral and memories stayed where you left them. He folded the note carefully and slid it into his pocket, aware that the paper felt warmer than it should. The language on it tugged at something half buried in his mind, a sound he almost recognized but could not name. Lucas looked toward the ceiling, measuring the distance between himself and the room above. Nothing moved, but the feeling of being observed did not fade. He unpacked only what he needed, keeping his back to the wall as if the open space behind him might betray him. The house smelled of damp wood and old dust, layered with something metallic that reminded him of rain left too long in a bucket. He had chosen this place because it felt forgotten, like a mistake no one bothered to correct. For years, invisibility had been his only ambition, a quiet life with no witnesses and no questions. Buying the worst house on the block had seemed like an extension of that plan, almost logical. Now, standing beneath an unlocked door and an occupied ceiling, logic felt thin and unreliable. Lucas placed a chair beneath the back door handle, not to lock it but to hear it move. The gesture made him feel foolish, but slightly less exposed. Sleep came late and shallow, dragging him down only to release him again without warning. Every sound sharp in the dark, each creak of the house carrying the weight of intention. He dreamed of hallways that bent inward, rooms rearranging themselves when he turned his head. When he woke, his heart was racing and the room felt subtly wrong, as if it had shifted overnight. Morning light crept through the blinds in narrow strips that did nothing to reassure him. Lucas lay still, listening for movement above, below, anywhere but inside his own chest. The house remained quiet, patient in a way that unsettled him more than noise would. He eventually rose, because staying in bed felt like surrender. In the daylight, the house looked smaller, its flaws more obvious and less threatening. Cracks in the walls traced careless paths, and the stairs groaned openly with each step. Lucas moved slowly, inspecting rooms he had barely glanced at the day before. The upstairs hallway ended in 3 closed doors, all of them painted the same dull white. He hesitated before the first, his hand hovering inches from the knob. The memory of the footsteps returned with uncomfortable clarity, measured and restrained. Opening the door revealed an empty bedroom coated in dust and neglect. Relief came briefly, then thinned when he noticed a window was open. The second room was smaller, cluttered with broken furniture and boxes left behind by someone else. Lucas felt like an intruder in a life that had ended without conclusion. He resisted the urge to search too deeply, afraid of what he might find or recognize. The third door stood at the end of the hall, slightly ajar despite the others being closed, and a faint smell drifted from within, sharper than the rest of the house. He pushed the door open with care, bracing himself for resistance that never came. Inside was a narrow room with no bed, no chair, and no window. The walls were covered in shallow scratches that stopped abruptly at shoulder height. Lucas stepped back, his pulse pounding as explanations failed to assemble. The marks were too deliberate to be damaged and too uniform to be random. He reached out, running his fingers along one of the lines. Feeling the groove catch his skin, a sense of recognition flickered and vanished, leaving behind a hollow ache. He told himself it was just another reason the house had been cheap. Still, the idea of someone spending time here, marking the walls, unsettled him deeply. Lucas closed the door and leaned against it, forcing himself to breathe steadily. The house felt less like shelter now and more like a record. Downstairs, he made coffee he barely tasted and sat at the small kitchen table. The note burned against his leg where it rested in his pocket. Demanding attention, he unfolded again, studying the circled line with growing frustration. The language teased his memory, pulling at something he had learned and tried to forget. Lucas whispered the words aloud, testing their sound in the quiet room. Saying them made the air feel heavier, as though it had absorbed the meaning. He stopped when he heard a faint creak above him, slow and careful. This time, he knew he was not alone. The footsteps did not retreat or advance, but lingered as if waiting for a response. Lucas remained still, caught between the instinct to flee and the need to understand. Every part of him warned that asking questions had once cost him everything. Yet the house seemed to offer no peace without confrontation. He folded the note again, more gently now, and stood from the table. The sound above shifted slightly, acknowledging his movement. Lucas looked toward the stairs, feeling the weight of a choice, forming. Whatever was here knew he had arrived, and it was no longer hiding.